My name is Daisy Yi, and I turned 18 this year. My family lives in a large home in California, and we never have to worry about food or money. My father is a real estate agent, a tough-looking but brave man, and my mother is a kind teacher who always looks after the family. Everything seemed to be going smoothly in that comfortable home until one day, when it was a gloomy afternoon with dark clouds gathered thickly as if to warn of something bad. As usual, my mother and I were in the kitchen making dinner together while we waited for my father to return home from a long day of work. The smell of my mother's soup filled the air, making it feel cozier despite the chilly wind outside. But that atmosphere was abruptly broken when the phone rang and I froze in place. My mother answered the phone, and in a matter of minutes, everything changed drastically. My father's voice was shaking and very different from his usual one. Typical assurance. I looked at my mother and saw that she was trying to remain calm, but her eyes were full of worry about tomorrow. "You two must quickly move back to the country," my father said in a voice full of exhaustion. He said that his company had gone bankrupt, that he had no money left to maintain, and that he was forced to sell the house to pay off the debt. These words were like a thunderbolt that struck my mother and me, causing everything we owned, including the beloved house we had lived in since childhood, to go. "Return to your grandfather's house, where we still have a roof over our heads." I was shocked by what my father said. I rarely went to my father's hometown because my grandfather had lived alone in an old house since my grandmother passed away. I remember my grandfather from when I was younger, when he used to joke with me and treat me like a treasure, but it has been so long since I last saw him that I can no longer clearly remember his face. The following morning, we packed our bags and left the familiar surroundings. When we finally arrived, an old house appeared before our eyes. The roof was discolored by time, the peeling walls revealed old bricks, and surrounding it was a large garden with many fruit trees. My father had gone somewhere since he called to tell me the bad news, so it was just my mother and I in the small car. We drove the long road back to our hometown, the scenery on both sides gradually changing from bright high-rise buildings to muddy dirt roads and vast fields. The sense of desolation and silence made my heart ache. Had become green. I was a little apprehensive when I got out of the car before this one crazy and weird scene, but then the main door of the house creaked open and I saw my grandfather leaving, which made me a little hunched. His deep eyes seemed older than I remembered, and he smiled when he saw us, especially me, when I was little. However, there was something strange and indefinable in his eyes now. It was not the gentleness I knew, but rather a deeper, more attentive look, but I didn't give it much thought. Simply believing that it was because he had grown older and changed over the years, we welcomed my grandfather and he enthusiastically showed us around the house. Everything was old, the furniture was basic, but he had made sure everything was clean and made a bed for my mother and me, showing me how thoughtful he was. Although it wasn't as fancy as the previous house, it was still warm in a unique way, and in the beginning, everything seemed calm because my grandfather always took care of us. Narrated tales and assisted my mother in adjusting to the new life, but the longer I remained, the more I saw that my grandfather's eyes had grown odd as he stared at me whenever I sat in the yard reading a book or stood in front of the mirror combing my hair. Every time I turned around, I felt like someone was watching me. I frequently caught my grandfather's eyes, but instead of the warmth I remember from my childhood, he gave me a suspicious look. I'm not sure if it was because I was wearing rather chilly clothing. The city I used to dress comfortably and simply, but now that I think about it, perhaps he wasn't used to this perception of me because he hadn't seen me like that in a while. When he reacted that way for the first time, I told myself that there probably wasn't anything to worry about other than the difference in lifestyle between the city and the country. Then one day, it was a calm midday, and my mother was out of the house because she had to go to town. In the morning, only my grandfather and I were home, so I sat on the old sofa. I was holding the book I had finished reading a few days earlier in the living room, where the chair had faded over the years but was still extremely comfortable, under the window's faint rays of sunlight, lighting a tiny area of the room, creating a peaceful and dreamlike atmosphere. I was so focused on reading that I didn't notice the slight sounds coming from behind me until my grandfather abruptly entered the room carrying a tray of carefully peeled fruit, including oranges, pears, and apples. He walked slowly toward me, placed the plate of fruit on the table, and grinned. His words were warm. "You eat. I just prepared it. You have to eat a lot of fruit for good health." I nodded slightly, grinned, and said, "Thank you, Grandpa." I then picked up a piece of apple, took a small bite, and returned my attention to the book in my hand, feeling appreciative of his small concern. Grandpa was usually so kind, and every act of kindness was done with such care, but I couldn't help but notice that he had taken a seat on the. I initially assumed he was just trying to sit and relax because his eyes were fixated on me, but the prolonged stillness embarrassed me. He sat there without saying anything and continued to stare at me despite my best efforts to ignore it. I forced a grin as I lifted my face to look at him, concentrating on the book that seemed to scorch the distance between us. After a time, he spoke gently, breaking the stillness, saying, "You've really grown up. Just the other day I was holding you, and now you've become such a beautiful girl." "Yes, grandfather, time goes by so quickly," I said quietly, sensing my. He continued speaking quietly as if he were thinking, "The older you get, the more beautiful you become." His eyes, which were starting to heat up on his cheek, looked at me differently than the grandfather's eyes I knew when I was little. They were no longer warm and gentle, but something indescribable made me feel uneasy. "These eyes and face all resemble your mother when she was young, but you have your own unique features that no one can compare to." I smiled slightly to conceal the embarrassment that was rising in my. "You flatter me too much, Hart. I'm just a regular person." He went on as if he wanted to continue the conversation, saying, "I used to carry you around the garden. Do you remember when you were a little girl you kept chattering to me about this and that, and now in just a few years you've become such a beautiful young woman with such a graceful figure?" I said, my eyes still glued to the book, trying to appear calm, but inside I felt uncomfortable at all his compliments. I was confused and didn't know how to respond properly. Awkwardness, yes. I recall how much fun that was back then. He would constantly treat me and would not take his eyes off of me. Even though I wasn't really reading anything, I was embarrassed as I turned the pages of the book, bowing my head and shaking my hand. His words left me unsure of how to react. "You're still young, it's too early to think about that," I replied softly, trying to keep my composure. "You're not only beautiful, but you're very charming, and the boys would definitely be crazy about you. I just wish there was someone good enough to take good care of you." Calmness. Grandpa gave me a smile and looked at me for a moment before getting up and saying, "Yes, you're right, let me read. I'll go out to the garden for a while." With that, he left the room, leaving me sitting there feeling relieved that the conversation was over. I exhaled a sigh of relief, feeling as though an invisible burden had been lifted. When he left, I dared to look around the room. It was quiet again, but something in my heart remained inexplicable, and the book in my hand seemed pointless because my mind was no longer. After that conversation, everything seemed to get even harder to describe. My grandfather's eyes were no longer the warm gaze I knew he had, but there was something in the way he looked at me that made me unable to be completely comfortable like before. I tried to ignore it, telling myself that I was just thinking too much, but in reality, every time he was close, I couldn't stop thinking. Stop my heart from feeling anxious and confused. Then, one morning, my mother had to leave again, saying she had to go help my father with some important work in the city. This meant that my grandfather and I were alone at home, and when I heard her say that, I couldn't help but feel uneasy about him. I didn't want to admit it, but I started to feel that something was wrong with my grandfather. It wasn't just his eyes anymore. Occasionally, he also displayed strange behaviors that I couldn't comprehend. Prevent my heart from experiencing confusion and anxiety. My mother then had to depart once more one morning, stating that she needed to go assist my father with some crucial task in the city. When she said that, I couldn't help but feel anxious about my grandfather because it meant that we were alone at home. Although I didn't want to acknowledge it, I began to suspect that my grandfather was experiencing more than simply vision problems. On sometimes, he also demonstrated peculiar behaviors that I couldn't understand. That piece just made me more anxious today because I was already feeling apprehensive about my grandfather. On days like that, grandfather's garden was quite lovely, with birds chirping in the background and a little wind sweeping through, causing each leaf to swing. I was trying to focus on my book and not worry about anything else when I heard a weird sound behind me. It was like light footfall on soft grass, and it made my pulse race. I carefully turned my head, and my grandfather was there, as I had imagined. He approached slowly but steadily, and his eyes never left me. Despite my desire to get up and leave right away, I couldn't take my eyes off him as he drew closer until he was just a few steps away. I tried to remain composed, but my face showed the tension. I shook a little as I yelled out my voice, and he stopped just in front of me, looking at me with a look I had never seen before. His voice was deep but strange, and I said, "I like you, Lily." I was in disbelief, and my head was spinning. "You are the most gorgeous girl I have ever seen in my life. You are flawless from your eyes to your skin to your smile." I couldn't believe who I had just heard, but he persisted in his speech. I stood, still utterly bewildered and unsure of how to respond. My heart was racing, My entire body was paralyzed, and I couldn't take my eyes off him. However, I was also unable to speak, and those words from the grandfather I used to admire were like a cold knife piercing my brain. He stood there, his eyes steady and full of desire, staring at me, and I could feel his. Inhale. My feet were glued to the floor, and I couldn't help but notice that I still couldn't say anything. A flurry of frantic thoughts raced through my head, but none of them were powerful enough to help me get out of this situation. I felt as though I was trapped in a weird dream where everything was hazy and frightening. The intimacy left me speechless. You know, he continued, his voice full of passion. You have grown into a beautiful young lady. Yes, I did manage to speak a few things after a lengthy quiet. If you don't say that, then he kept approaching me until I could feel his breathing. My pulse was racing, and my feet were stuck to the floor. When he finally stopped in front of me, his slender fingers gently reached up and grasped my hand. The sensation of his rough flesh on mine made me shudder. His voice was thick and ambiguous. Do you realize, Lily, that I want you to be mine? He grabbed my hand, and I saw an emotion in his eyes that I had never seen before. Not the love of a grandfather, and I frantically tried to take my hand back, but I lacked the strength, and I was frantically trying to think of a way out of this predicament. Grandpa, I spoke out in a shaky but resolute voice. He looked at me, his face surprised and a little disappointed. But you know, I've been thinking about this for a long time. You've grown into a beautiful woman, and all I want is to be with you, protect you, and love you like I've never loved anyone before. Grandpa, you shouldn't do that because I'm your granddaughter. I took a step back, my hand still shaking. I can't, since I'm your. We can't be like this, granddaughter. Please stop. He fell silent, his eyes changing from longing to distant sadness. He slowly let go of my hand and stepped back, his voice drowning in guilt. I'm sorry, I shouldn't have done that. I don't know what happened to me. He gave me one last look, his eyes full of regret, and then he turned and walked away, slowly disappearing behind the garden's trees. I stood motionless, unable to move or speak, my heart still pounding. When he left, I breathed a sigh of relief, as though I had just been released from a nightmare. From that day on, I tried to avoid him whenever he came into my sight, since my quick dread was still resonating in every breath. I was afraid and bewildered, unsure of what to do or if I should tell my mother. I also sensed that the gap between us was widening, and all I could think about was concern. Fortunately, my mother entered my life shortly after my parents returned. I looked at my mother and felt an indescribable sense of relief as she said, "Everything in the city has been resolved, my father's work has stabilized again, and we can return home." She smiled gently and said that everything seemed to have been lifted, and I no longer had to be afraid when I was around him. Soon after, my father came back beaming and declaring that everything was back to normal. As the whole family got ready to leave my grandfather's house and head back to the city, I had a mix of relief and melancholy that I will never forget. When my grandfather's eyes and actions changed our relationship forever, I felt safe and thankful that it was finally over. As we were getting into the car, I caught my grandfather's eyes, which were sad and deep, as if he was trying to say something but couldn't get the words out. He didn't dare look me in the eye. Instead, he just stood there quietly observing from a distance, and I didn't have the courage to look him in the eye. Bravery to confront him. I had a lot of conflicting feelings after everything that had happened, including fear, worry, and a little sympathy for him. I knew that even though he was wrong, he probably felt regret, but I couldn't get over those tense moments because everything had happened so quickly and confusingly that our relationship had changed. We both needed time to calm down and heal the emotional wounds, and maybe to mend this relationship if it could ever be the same again. The car started, and I could hear the sound of the engine braking. The garden's quiet. My grandfather was standing alone in the middle of the big yard, his silver hair swaying gently in the wind, and I could feel the loneliness all around him. He had lived alone here for a long time, and now he had to go back to that silence once more. As we left him alone, I sighed, feeling sad and guilty because, despite everything, he was still my grandfather, the relative I once loved and respected, but we were now separated by a distance that neither of us could overcome. The car rolled